Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Farr, president of the Religious Freedom Institute. Welcome to another in our series of webinars on religious freedom. At RFI, we defend religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. We call it religious freedom equality. We make the case to those with power and influence in nations around the world, including our own nation, that religious freedom equality is the right policy, both in a moral sense, but also in a strategic sense. It's a smart policy. Religious freedom equality can help advance the interests of almost every country on the planet, politically, socially, economically, religiously, and strategically. We've experienced these benefits in the United States for over 2 centuries. Unfortunately, the consensus over the value of religious freedom in America is in decline. But happily, that decline has not been evident in America's international religious freedom policy, where bipartisanship has, for the most part, been the order of the day. Today, we're going to examine that policy, in part through the lens of an executive order issued in June by President Trump. Now, this document is worthy of discussion in its own right. We're not going to go through the whole thing, so I urge you to read it if you haven't. It's also an important starting point for the Biden administration, which of course is now deciding how to shape its own IRF policy. In my view, there's much in the executive order and in the programs initiated by our current ambassador that can serve our nation well under any administration. So let's get started. I'm going to begin by introducing all 3 members of our panel, then briefly place our discussion in a bit of historical context. Then I'll pose some questions to our guests about the executive order and our policy in general, keeping the future in mind. Our first panelist is Ambassador Sam Brownback. In February 2018, Ambassador Brownback was sworn in as America's 5th Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom. Before becoming ambassador, he had served Kansas in the U.S. House of Representatives, in the Senate, and as its governor. As a senator, Sam Brownback was a champion of religious freedom and was a key sponsor of the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, or the IRFA. As Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, he has pioneered at least 3 major new programs: the Ministerial on International Religious Freedom, the Global IRF Alliance, and the Global IRF Roundtable of Religious and Civil Society Groups. RFI was honored to bring all 5 U.S. ambassadors, including Ambassador Brownback, together in our 20th anniversary celebration of the IRFA back in 2018. Each of these men and women has contributed to the ambitious American policy that we're here to discuss today. None has had more impact on that ambition and turning it into action than has Ambassador Sam Brownback. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for being with us today. Welcome. Our second panelist, Samah Norquist, is Chief Advisor for International Religious Freedom to the Administrator at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and is leading that agency's implementation of President Trump's executive order. We'll ask her about that in a few minutes. Ms. Norquist also leads the development of all U.S. IRF policy and programs at USAID. Previously, she had managed, among other things, the agency's genocide recovery and persecution response in northern Iraq. That vital program has been responsible both for saving lives and for increasing the chances that those lives are going to be fruitful and happy. Samah, thank you for your service to our country and to those around the world suffering because of religious persecution. Welcome to our seminar. Our third panelist is Chris Seiple, Principal Advisor to the Templeton Religion Trust's Covenantal Pluralism Initiative, and Chris is also the Senior Fellow for Comparative Religion at the Jackson School of International Studies. Dr. Seiple is past president of the Institute for Global Engagement, which many of you know. He's the author of several books and countless articles. He's a longtime friend and fellow combatant on behalf of the victims of religious persecution. Chris Seiple is among the most experienced and savvy defenders of religious freedom equality in the world. It's an honor to have him with us. Chris, welcome. It's good to see you. Let me begin by briefly putting our discussion in historical context, and then we'll turn to our guests. Our nation has long understood religious freedom as the first freedom, and for that reason has always had an interest in how religious freedom was treated abroad, around the world. In 1998, that longstanding interest was codified in the International Religious Freedom Act, which was passed unanimously by Congress and signed by President Bill Clinton. As we look back on it, that bipartisanship is both striking and admirable. All of us should strive to retain it. The IRFA established the office, now headed by Ambassador Brownback, and the position of Ambassador at Large, in which he serves. IRFA gave the ambassador the responsibility of advancing religious freedom around the world on behalf of the United States. The law also established the Commission on International Religious Freedom, of which the ambassador is an ex officio member, and charged it with being a kind of watchdog over our policy, issuing its own reports and recommendations. In 2017, IRFA was expanded and strengthened by the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act. The policy established by IRFA is now in its 23rd year. It's been pursued by 4 administrations, 2 Republican and 2 Democrat, and now to be succeeded by the 5th administration, a Democrat administration. It's been headed by 5 splendid ambassadors. It served our nation well. All right, let's get into this issue by framing it with the June executive order. Ambassador Brownback, let's begin with you. Would you talk to us a little bit about what you think the president had in mind with this executive order? I'll just say I was struck by the preface to it, or the first part of it, the principles articulated in the beginning, that religious freedom is a gift of God, not of the state, that it's necessary for flourishing of all societies, that its advancement is both a moral and a national security imperative for the United States. It also stressed the importance of partnering with civil society organizations, which I know has been important to you. So talk to us, if you would, about what you think the president was doing here.
Well, first, thanks, Tom, for hosting this, and thank you for the work of your institute. It's just been fabulous, and it's global, and it's so needed now. I think what the president was after was to see that this foundational human right would flourish within the bureaucracy of the United States. And, and this has been a debate as we've gone along. I was there at the first bill when it was being passed. Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State. And there was a real debate within State Department whether or not to engage religious freedom, that we've got the separation of church and state. So we don't want to be too close to religion. And Madeleine Albright, to her credit, was saying, no, I think this could be a useful engagement. It obviously needs parameters, but we should engage. And they have. I think what this does is further that discussion and the implementation of religious freedom into all the foreign policy apparatus pieces that we have, not just the Ambassador for Religious Freedom, but the broader state, AID, the impacts of various agencies, Treasury, agriculture, commerce, saying that they all should look at this foundational human right. And one final point I want to put here, because you've got great panelists, we should hear from all of them, is that we look at this religious freedom foundational right, that if you can get it right as a nation, other human rights will flourish. If you get it wrong, other human rights will diminish. So as such, it's really occupies a very strategic and important space. And the overall Human Rights Project has been in decline around the world for the last couple of decades. So we thought, let's get narrowed in on this one. In football terms, this would be blocking and tackling. Let's get our blocking and tackling right, and then we'll be able to throw passes and do other things, but not until we get this one right. And I think that's true. And I think we'll see a flourishing of human rights as this one is taken care of and moved forward.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Ambassador. And it reminds me of the Commission on Unalienable Rights that was just within the last 6 months done on behalf of the State Department, headed by appointed by Secretary Pompeo, headed by Ambassador Marianne Glendon. And it made the point you just did, and that is that there are certain rights that are just fundamental to every human being. It doesn't matter where they live or what their policy views are, their politics or anything else. They're unalienable. They're given by God because they're human beings. Nothing more is needed. And religious freedom historically has been thought of as the first of those. So I'm so glad you made that point. These things are interlocked, and we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. If I could turn briefly then to Samah, or immediately I should say, to Samah, the executive order, as you know, instructs the secretary in consultation with the USAID administrator to develop a plan to prioritize religious freedom in the planning and implementation of our foreign policy and our foreign assistance. Now, you shepherded this plan, which I gather is either going to or has gone to the president. It's not yet public, and so we understand that constraint. But could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Tom, and for you and RFI for hosting us and hosting me today, for the incredible work that you guys have been doing over the years to advance religious freedom all around the world for everyone. It's also a true privilege to be on a panel with two incredible human beings, such as Ambassador Brownback and my good friend, Chris Seiple. You've touched about you and Ambassador Brownback have touched about the importance of religious freedom as part of American fabric. Respect for religious freedom is a core American value. It's found in our Constitution. It's our first freedom. It's not something different or new. And as a matter of fact, I would argue, being born overseas and grew up overseas, it was one of the shining stars that people overseas around the world look at the United States, freedom. And certainly the practice and freedom of practicing faith and ability to do that and participate in your society is an important thing that people aspire to around the world. And Ambassador Brownback is very right. When the work started before the executive order, there was a lot of movement that the Trump administration made sure and made it clear that advancing international religious freedom was a top priority of this foreign policy of this administration. Now, every administration came and talked about it. It's a bipartisan. It's an American issue. It's an American value. It's not about being a Republican or a Democrat. What the Trump administration did is actually gave us the important tools, box of tools, for the State Department, mandating both the State Department and USAID to use that toolbox to incorporate the principles of advancing religious freedom into our core diplomacy and development. What does that mean? It means a lot of things. From a USAID perspective, we've been doing this work, right? We've been working with vulnerable and marginalized communities all around. But as Ambassador Brownback mentioned, is it okay to talk to faith communities? Is it okay to talk about faith? That's not the question. The question is, are we there to respond to the needs of those communities that have been targeted because of their faith, just like we saw in northern Iraq? What happened in northern Iraq, there are communities, whether Yazidis or Christians or Shia, were particularly targeted because of their faith, nothing else except their faith. And what the United States needed to do is to respond, and we did. And we did swiftly, and it's not a perfect picture, but the United States was able to say, we're there to help. And now, religious challenges to religious freedom takes different forms and shapes, right? It doesn't have to be just persecution like what ISIS did in northern Iraq. But it could be atrocities, it could be repressions, it could be discrimination against your own communities. So what does the executive order allow us to do in order to address all these challenges? What USAID will do is we'll look through the implementation plan, is look at expanding our existing efforts and realign foreign aid to better reflect individual country circumstances when it comes to challenges to international religious freedom. Both the State Department and USAID will work together in the field. Our former administrator, Mark Green, used to say, I don't do development in Washington, we do it in the field. And it's very true. But it's also, by the same token, we do things in the field with the local communities, because it's the local communities that can identify the needs that we need to respond to, and we need to address, and we need to give our assistance. The USAID embodies the generosity of the American people, and the American people likes to do goodwill around the world. And this is not something new and different that USAID has been doing. And we look forward to institutionalize that work across the agency, across our programs, whether it's education, health, economic development, democracy, and political empowerment, all that stuff that elevates the economic and political situation for people on the ground.
Thank you, Samah. And I'm so glad you raised the faith communities. Could you just expand just for a moment? I mentioned in the introduction the work of USAID in Iraq and northern Iraq, just a little bit on those communities that have been the Yazidis, the Mandaeans, the Christians, the Muslim communities that have been targeted in part because of their religious beliefs, and what USAID has done to help them.
Sure. So from all the travel and engagement and understanding of what's happening on the ground, whether in northern Iraq or across the globe, USAID is no stranger to partnering with faith-based organizations to do work, whether it was countering malaria or AIDS or respond to persecution. All that work, what faith-based organizations bring to the table is the familiarity and the trust that local communities have, whether you're a Catholic organization or evangelical or Muslim, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is, because people in those countries, particularly in the Middle East, I'm a product of the Middle East. I grew up in the Middle East. Both my parents were born there. I was born there, but I'm also very privileged to be an American citizen and serve in this administration and serve the American people. And this issue, I grew up with it, and I've seen the firsthand impact of things that means. The mosaic of the Middle East, with its Christian populations and Jewish population, Muslim population, that's what makes the history of the Middle East rich. That's what makes the culture of the Middle East rich. Without the preservation and helping make sure that these communities don't leave the Middle East and stay home, whether even across the world, whether in Middle East, whether it's in Africa or Asia, these are the indigenous and real people that have contribution to their own homeland. And we have a really good opportunity to keep empowering them and partnering with them and working with them on the local level, and give them access to our foreign assistance in order to be able to respond to the real needs of those people on the ground.
Thank you, Samah. Chris, you've watched this policy since its inception. You've been involved in it. You've advised secretaries of state. You've written about it. You've critiqued it. Let me invite you to respond to what the ambassador and Samah have said, but also, if you would, tell us how the extent to which you think this issue of religious freedom now, and it's entering its 23rd year, is it really, are we there yet? Has it been integrated into our diplomacy as you have advocated for so many years? And how do you see the executive order playing into this issue?
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks for your kind words of introduction. And so wonderful to be with some old friends who are been companions in this sojourn for so long. Which is to say, we've come a long way, Tom, but we've got a long way to go. And our job is to be obedient. Our job is to keep showing up, keep trying to make it, keep loving our neighbor. The good news in all of this is that the approach to international religious freedom has never been more institutionalized. You know, when the act passed in October 9th, 1998, Democrat Senator Joe Lieberman said, we have the right to put our values at the center of foreign policy. And when my father, the first ambassador, when I interviewed him for my dissertation on Uzbekistan, how does this all come together? He said, look, I got three priorities: operationalize religious freedom, practice reconciliation, and integrate this into the rest of the foreign policy. Well, that was a pipe dream back then, but he started a process that has now taken form through several ministerials at this point, three, several roundtables that have been going on for some time, the International Religious Freedom Alliance, this executive order. I mean, this is all positive stuff, but here's the bottom line. As a former Marine who needs to walk the ground in the cold light of day, we've never been more institutionalized, but we've never seen more persecution. The new Pew reports are out, and there's never been more persecution. So we're getting our act together and how this gets institutionalized, but obviously we've got to go to another level here as civil society, as a government. And there's a whole bunch of things that we can talk about there, but let me try to limit these things, because at the first ministerial, Samah referenced Mark Green, who's now at the McCain Institute. And Mark spoke at that first ministerial, and he, if I remember right, he ended toward the end of his talk, he said, look, religious pluralism is a function of development. And it's an expression of our values. And so religious pluralism, this presence of diversity that has to be mutually engaged across difference, is something that development and diplomatic and even defense initiatives ought to encourage. USAID just had a strategic religious engagement summit where we talked about all this stuff thanks to the leadership of Kirsten Evans over there. I was an advisor to that process. But these worlds all come together, and they come together in places like Northern Iraq, where I've also time where religious pluralism is the canary in the coal mine. It's the indicator of a healthy society. And oh, by the way, we are better when there are more. You know, Voltaire has this famous quote where he says, if you have one religion, you're going to have a totalitarian state. If you have two, you're probably going to have civil war. But if you have 30, there's going to be peace, because there's a marketplace, there's a level playing field. And people have the opportunity to choose, not only like they choose products, but they choose their faith. And then they have the freedom to bring that faith into the public square, into the vocations and locations that is their profession in society and in the state. So I think these are the things that we need to work on going forward. And what does that look like? I've got lots of ideas, and you mentioned the next administration. We can throw around some of those ideas, but we have to build on this amazing institutionalization, but we have to be humble, because there's a lot of work to do, because some of this old ways have to change as we proceed down the path together.
Well, thank you, Chris. Let me just ask one follow-on, then I'm going to turn to Ambassador Brownback on this. But one of the things you have looked at for a long time is the relationship between national security and what you've been talking about. And thank you for mentioning that Pew Forum, Pew Research Center report. These reports have been coming out now for well over a decade. And as you said, I mean, it's gotten worse, it's gotten bad. I thought it was bad, you know, in the last couple of years. But as you said, the most recent report says it's worse than it's ever been. And so as you say, we have this trajectory in our own policy. It's hard to conceive of it having become more active and so forth. But what's happened, in addition to some pretty bad governments and some bad guys out there, the Chinese, to pick one, but there are others we could pick, this terrible business we had with the Rohingya Muslims, for example, the genocidal stuff. Is there a way we can briefly, Chris, I know you have a lot to say about this, but is there a way that we could get in front of this as a government? Is there a way we can begin to see how these things are going to happen? We do have the CPC designations, which have just come out for this year. But what's your advice to the new administration on that problem, foreseeing these terrible things and trying to put in place ways to prevent them or deal with them as they emerge?
Thanks. All these things are predictable. You know, I was in Burma in 2012 and the writing was on the wall there. And I'm so grateful to Sam. That was his first trip as ambassador, was to go see the Rohingya and set that example that like the Institute, it's religious freedom for everybody, all faiths and none. And that's what has to be done. There's a lot of things that can be done, I think, but when we revisit all these issues, I think we have to come back to some basic things. What are our comparative advantages and what are the roles of each player? The comparative advantage of the government, in my mind, is to our government or any government is to catalyze and convene, to bring people together, to call attention to these things, and then also to fund. But governments don't fund so quickly. You know, I'm also in the philanthropic world now. We need them to fund faster, and we need them to fund local actors. And this is the model that Samah pioneered as the special envoy for USAID for religious freedom and pluralism, because the two go hand in hand. And you have to find ways to embed these programs of reconciliation and religious pluralism in the programs. But then here's the next one. You've got to have staff who embody those values as well. And that's a tricky part, because our own government has to think about the establishment clause fairly, for sure. But at the same time, it cannot be an excuse not to do the right thing the right way according to our values, which is also according to our self-interest, which is enable as many religious minorities as possible so they can live their faith and be good citizens of their country. And by the way, I'll stop here. I know you want me to be brief. There's a lot of good people in China. And I've worked with them. I've worked with government officials. I've been to Xinjiang many times and in Tibet. This is a season. We hope it will pass, but we want it to pass such that the good people can come back and reclaim the best of their country, the best of who they are, and live that out. But in the meantime, we have to speak truth to power. We are absolutely obligated to do that and provide practical ways to do so.
Well, that's a good segue, Ambassador Brownback, to what I wanted to ask you. Nobody has spoken truth to power in China more than you have. And this is a major dilemma for any administration. It's much in the news these days about what a potential threat China is to the United States. But in the midst of all of this are these terrible humanitarian disasters that are taking place, particularly with the Muslims in Xinjiang province, but also with the Tibetan Buddhists and with Christians, Catholics and Protestants, with President Xi's policies. Would you talk to us a little bit about China, but broaden this into what Chris raised as well, which I think all of our ambassadors have done well, and you've taken to a new height. As he said, your first trip was to visit the refugee camps for the Rohingya Muslims. You have championed everybody, and this is purely American. It is the way we ought to do our policy. It is the way we are doing it, but sometimes we don't get credit for that. It's as if we were nothing but a group of people out there advancing the interests of Christians abroad only. We advance religious freedom for everybody. So talk to us a little bit about your attitude on this and bringing into bear China and the rest of these. You've done an awful lot of work.
Well, thanks, Tom. And I appreciate what Chris said. I can, you can sure see his years of experience and his skill at being able to boil down all of this into some tight areas. And I agree. We've done a lot, and we've got a lot to do. That religious freedom doesn't work unless it's for everybody, everywhere, all the time. If it were just for Christians, it doesn't work. You got to stand up for it, and it includes people who have no faith at all. It includes humanists. You have to stand up for their religious freedom to be able to believe or not believe whatever they choose. But together, the thing really does stand, and it stands firmly. It builds a pluralistic society. It builds an open society that's able to then kind of listen and pick and choose and grow from each other's experience and expression. And I want to make this point very clear, because I get it thrown back to me quite a bit. This is not about establishing a common theology. We don't agree on theology. This is about establishing a common human right, which we all agree upon. And I think that's just foundational to all this. And it's very American as well. Now, China is going the exact opposite. China, a communist, atheistic government, is now seeking to put its will down in front and center on the people and to force it. And they're going to either force it by you going into a detention facility, or you being in a virtual police state where there's cameras watching you all the time and artificial intelligence systems and limitations of your movement, to the point that I was on a program the other day with the head of the Central Tibetan Authority, and he said, look, either the world community changes China, or China will change the world community. You're gonna go one of these two ways here. And if you go by the Pew numbers, you'd say, well, China's doing pretty well right now about controlling. We don't want a world like that. We don't want a world where you are limited by your government as to what you can do in your faith. That just rubs against our skin. And so that's why I think it's so important to push back on China, and it needs to be a global community do it. The United States has stepped up. This administration has done more than anybody else has ever done to push back on China. It needs to be continued, and it needs to grow to a number of other countries.
Could I just ask you on that, Mr. Ambassador? I just know from long experience, and I'm sure everyone else here does too, that there are a lot of people who say, well, this religious freedom business is okay, but it's a boutique issue. When you come to China, can you separate out what you just said about what the Tibetan representative said to you? China is a danger in many ways. And I think many American foreign policy experts believe that, and they're going to, in the future, in the next administration, probably fashion American foreign policy. Can they separate out what is happening to the Tibetan Buddhists and the Muslims and the Christians in China as if it were unrelated to what China is doing otherwise, Hong Kong and elsewhere?
I suppose you could. You always probably could try to bifurcate things. I think it would be wrong, and I think it would take the strength away. We are best when we stand on fundamental issues and fundamental human rights. It was what helped bring the Soviet Union down. When we stood with the Jewish refuseniks. You could call the Jewish refusenik movement during the Soviet Union a boutique issue. It only affected so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in a billions of people planet. But it became a core issue, and it became the story of what the Soviet Union was doing to people. And people could understand it, and they could see it. You can understand what's taking place in Xinjiang. You can understand what's happened to the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government's assertion that they get to appoint the next Dalai Lama, which is completely ludicrous. Not even the Chinese dynasties in the past attempted something like that galling. But this is not a boutique issue. This is at the core of what we're about in standing for human rights.
Absolutely right. And I would add to that, as you yourself have said, that there's a relationship between, and as the executive order says, there's a relationship between religious freedom and the other things that a government does, whether they're good things or bad things. And so what President Xi Jinping is doing is removing internally with these, among other things that he's doing, is removing opposition from religious groups. Religion itself is by its nature an authority greater than government. Most religions are. And all the tyrants in history have understood this, which is why Hitler and Stalin and Mao tried to get rid of religion, destroy it, because it opposes government by its nature. If you believe in something more important than the government, then you yourself are a limit on that government. And if you're part of a community then your community is the limit on government. That's something our founders understood. And I think to the extent that we advance religious freedom in any country, we're helping those countries understand that governments cannot and should not be trying to control everything in those states. If I could just shift a little bit, Mr. Ambassador, I mentioned earlier, and Chris mentioned them as well, he detailed 3 major programs that you have instituted during your time as ambassador. And I think in each of those you built on the work of your predecessors. Chris mentioned his father, who was the first of the 5. And then, of course, we had great ambassadors in between them as well, building on Ambassador Seiple, and then Ambassador Hanford, Ambassador Susan Johnson Cook, and then David Saperstein, and now you. Can you tell us a little bit about these 3, maybe beginning with the ministerial? And recently we had the 3rd of these ministerials in Warsaw. What did you have, and what's going on there, and how can that help internationalize what we're talking about in this conversation?
Well, that was the very feature of it. The ministerials, we wanted to bring together foreign ministers from around the world that were interested in the topic of religious freedom and get them together to talk about what their country would be willing to do for it. This was Secretary Pompeo's first ministerial and second. He did 2 of them. It was the largest human rights event ever hosted by State Department, the second one. It was very well received. People were ecstatic that we were doing this. We had a government day. We had civil society days as well. And the whole idea really is to build a global event that people could come together to push religious freedom. The next one will be hosted in Brazil. God willing, it'll be in person and virtual, probably some hybrid event. And the secretary's task to me was to make sure this continues for the next 20 years. And so we've got countries lined up to get this annual gathering. But we didn't leave it there. We also wanted the real intense countries that were very interested in religious freedom to bind together in a group. So that was the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. And it's more of a network than an alliance. It's 32 nations from all different continents. But it's the countries that are really interested in pushing on this. And it's us then sharing projects together about what can we do in Nigeria? What can we do focusing on the use of technology for religious oppression? What can we do to protect religious spaces in conflict zones? And taking these various topics with different countries leading on it and others pulling in behind them. And it provides an institutional global framework for it. And then the final piece was really the grassroots piece of it, and that was the religious freedom roundtables in various countries. We've got somewhere between 30 to 40 of those now, different countries. It's activists in that country, and it's activists from all various religions or none at all, coming together to stand for each other's religious freedom in that country and to project it around the world. And I think what we've got to have, Tom, is we've got to have both the global approach. That's the Air Force. You got to have the local approach, which is the grassroots one, the roundtables, and then I think you have to have this targeted strike team, which is the alliance. And I'm very pleased that these things have all happened. I think the movement now is going. It's just got to build and get up to speed because we've just got so much that it needs to do.
Can I just ask you one follow-on to that, and then I'll turn to Samah. We talked about the very important issue of standing for all religious communities, which we have, and Chris mentioned that your first visit was out, and I've mentioned it too, to visit the Muslims, the Rohingya Muslims. It's also important, I noticed in your IRF alliance, talking about those countries that have this already in their foreign policies, many of them, and trying to entice more and more of those countries in there. How important is it, and how can we do it? I know you think it's important, and all of us do, to get Muslim majority countries to be involved in seeing religious freedom for everyone as to their advantage. And I know you've talked to large numbers of Muslim leaders, including heads of state and so forth. How do we do that? I mean, do you agree this is important? We need to bring them into this alliance and get them arguing for this from their own point of view, from their sense of self-interest.
It's absolutely critical, Tom. If we don't do that, I don't know that we'll be able to get very far. So you've got to have these Muslim majority countries, and we have several that are in it right now, but we need more. One of the problems has been some of the apostasy and blasphemy laws that many of them historically have. And we're saying, look, you really have got to deal with this piece, because you just can't have these laws and declare that you're a religious freedom nation. And we require nations themselves, if you're going to be in the alliance, you got to live it yourself too, and you got to have it in your own practice. But I think it's critical. The good news is I've met with a number of Muslim leaders from various countries, and the leadership gets it and wants to do it and believes it's critical for their future growth. They may have been resource dependent in the past, but they don't see that providing the jobs and the opportunities that they need in the future. And their young people want to have the freedom to choose just like any other place and not have to immigrate to the US or Europe or Canada or Australia to experience this freedom. They want to be able to have that freedom at home. So there's a domestic component to a lot of these leaders wanting to open up those societies. So I think it's going to happen. It's just it's going to take nurturing and showing people this is doable. You can stay people can freely practice Islam in the way they choose, in the peaceful way they choose, and still be a religiously free country.
Right. And I would just add to that as we move forward, and the first hurdle here is for Muslims to understand, as many are beginning to do. I know that you have a good relationship, for example, with Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya and other Muslim leaders who are working very hard on this. I mean, these people are, like all of us on this panel, are very serious about their own religion, and we would expect them to be so. But he understands the relationship between Islam and the value of what we're talking about here today, and is being, I think, very, very productive and fruitful in the way that he talks about it. And one of the things that we have said, you have said, is that religious freedom over time can help bring economic development to these countries. And every country in the world, including Muslim majority countries, in some cases especially them, needs this economic development part of it. And of course, these blasphemy laws, I mean, we've had them, we still have some in the West. We know what they mean. They are initiated in the beginning as a way to protect the religion, but in the end, they don't protect the religion. And in fact, in these Muslim majority countries, it's often Muslims themselves that are victims of these blasphemy laws. So maybe we could use that to turn to Samah and point out that, as you know, in the CPC list, that just the countries of particular concern list, which for those that are listening that don't know, it's the absolutely the worst violators of religious freedom. They're designated every year by the Secretary of State. And then the United States has the option of imposing economic sanctions on them. Nigeria was, I think, the country that was just added to the list. I believe Sudan and was it Uzbekistan were recently moved down to the warning list, which is
taken off altogether.
They were taken off altogether. Okay, they were taken off altogether. Well, this is a sign of progress. So, Samah, maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about, the list and USAID's understanding of how, or your understanding of how, the economic elements of this, including the sanctions business, can play into this. And Chris, you may want to come in on this in a minute too. I mean, sanctions are a double-edged sword, and they're a blunt instrument sometimes, but sometimes they can be used to our advantage. Samah, what do you want to say about that for us?
So if you don't mind, Tom, there's a reason why I called Brownback and Chris Seiple two incredible human beings, because I've had the privilege and the fortune to be working with somebody like Ambassador Brownback throughout this administration, and with his stellar team that have been nothing but supportive and committed to the faith of everyone. As you know, and you all know, that I come from the Muslim faith, and I didn't learn about the Uyghurs until I told Chris Seiple the other day, I used to hear you talking about the Uyghurs long time ago, but now I haven't seen the passion and our country's leaders speaking about it and highlighting it on the level that Ambassador Brownback, Vice President Pence, and President Trump have been talking about, and certainly Secretary Pompeo. Also putting the Muslim world on the defense, on not speaking out loudly and clearly on the atrocities that the Chinese Communist Party are committing against the Muslims in Xinjiang. So I just want to commend Ambassador Brownback for his incredible leadership and all the work that he's done. And to touch a little bit on the ministerial that he led, throughout my travel in my current position and my previous position in the Middle East Bureau, my interaction with bilateral government officials, grassroots, civil society, local groups, everybody talked about the ministerial. Everybody took notice. The world took notice. The first one, maybe people were trying to understand what was going on. But by the second one, everybody understood where America's leadership stands in the world on this issue, and that we're serious about it. And when you have our president speaks about it, and our vice president continue to be doing it, elevating it, it means serious business. And from the effects that I've seen in grassroots, it makes a difference when America talks. Now you have countries in the Middle East elevating ministers and secretaries levels on advancing religious freedom and working. Everybody wants to sign MOUs with the US government now on doing work around the world to support advancing religious freedom. The United Arab Emirates have partnered and did a lot of restoration of churches in Mosul that were destroyed by ISIS. But that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have seen the international communities taking this issue seriously the way that they do now if it wasn't for the United States leadership on that issue. So I hope that we don't lose track of that, because as Chris Seiple mentioned earlier, we didn't institutionalize it before, and now we have every opportunity with the executive order, with the Secretary's implementation plan, to get this into the DNA of what America does in its diplomacy and foreign assistance overseas. But to go back to your question on the CPC, there's a lot. The executive order final plan puts a lot of mandates countries, U.S. ambassadors and mission directors to come up with action plans, particularly in those countries that come with the status of CPC or on the special watch list. So there is an interagency process between the State Department, USAID, and even USERV for all the countries that have committed atrocities and committed violations against freedom of religion around the world. How do our ambassadors and mission directors overseas reflect that bilateral engagement, action plans, engagement on the ground, and how can USAID work with more local groups or local even governments that we can mobilize and partner with in order to protect their own citizens? When we talk about religious freedom, we also talk about citizenship. We talk about pluralism. When citizens in the Middle East or in Asia or in Nigeria feel that they are full Nigerian citizens or full Iraqi citizens or full Egyptian citizens, that puts any sectorial differences aside and puts a lot of respect for other people's faith, because they all face the same challenges, economic challenges, development challenges, and we try to dissect and figure out where we can help and put our programs together in order to help these communities, particularly on the youth level. The Middle East has an incredible youth bulge. Unemployment is very down. and that opens space for recruitments and lack of education and lack of health, and that just opens the door if these for bad malign actors to come and recruit these. So that's neither in the economic interest of these countries nor in our own national interest and regional interest all over the world. So when we provide programs that elevates these communities, their participation into their own country's development and production increases, and their differences come inside and brings those society together and strengthen them even more.
Thank you, Samah. Chris, you've already emphasized, properly so, I think, the need for the American government to empower, through its grants and other mechanisms, other parts of civil society. But part of what the government does, for better or worse, and has been addressed in the executive order, is economic sanctions on these violator countries. That's been there since the 1998 RFA. The CPC list triggers necessarily a thinking about whether to impose different sanctions. What's your view on this? Does it work? Do you think the expansion of that under the executive order, the use of the Magnitsky Act, I'm not going to get that right, maybe you can get it for me. Pronounce that. That's your first question. Then second question is just sanctions. What is that? Does that work? Is it a good thing? And should the new administration recharge itself on that, or where does it fit in your view of how we succeed in this policy?
Yeah, Magnitsky. It's
Thank you.
And the EU just adopted it, which is a great thing. And I think what's different about it is it goes after the pocketbook, goes after the wallet.
Yeah.
And that scares people big time. And that's different than the sanctions that we currently have. I'm not a big fan of sanctions because they tend not to work, because you have to have them very coordinated. Certainly they should be an arrow in the quiver. But I think, and nor am I a fan, by the way, of name, blame, and shame, which almost never works. The reason, at least in my experience, having spent some time with the two countries that have come off the religious freedom violations list, Vietnam and Uzbekistan, the reason they want to be off the list is they don't want the black mark. They don't want to be on the same list with North Korea. That's not how they see themselves as globally responsible players. Uzbekistan, for example, is now on the UN Human Rights Council. We want them speaking to Saudi and to China with the tremendous progress that they've made and why they're now off the special watch list. That's a very intentional process that has taken place over the last 2 or 3 years. It also speaks to a different kind of model about how you do these things. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, that said, there's a time to name, blame, and shame. The good ambassador referenced the refuseniks and basically Jackson Vanik. I'm at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. I'm a big fan of Scoop Jackson because he was in this radical middle between leftover left and self-righteous right, and saying, look, at these are nonpartisan values and we need to stand up, and when we stand on them, they last. And by the way, alliances like NATO or the ERF alliance, they last because of values. They don't last because of interests. Interest in the transactional brings us together, but it's the values that leads to transformation over time, like we've seen in South Korea, like we've seen in Eastern Europe, and in other places around the world. We have to stand on those values. We have to know who we are, or we don't know where we're going. We've got to make that happen. The tricky part, though, is how do you walk with somebody? One example that we've been talking about that I can use to illustrate some of this is in 2006, I took a bunch of Chinese leaders to Chechnya, the border between Chechnya and Ingushetia in the North Caucasus. And the message was very simple. Chechnya today is Xinjiang tomorrow if you don't get your act together. So you have two options. One is you're going to have to round everybody up, sadly, or you're going to have to integrate people as full citizens. They have to find their story in your story of the country of China. there are good Chinese government officials and Communist Party members, for that matter, because, they wear the party membership as an overcoat to engage society. You can't go anywhere unless you have one. So not all communists are bad. Forgive me for saying that. But there are clearly some bad ones. And then you've got to engage and walk with them and show them why it's in their self-interest. And so I think that's very important in terms of this economic development argument that Brian Grimm has been making for some time, but also the security. When people don't feel like their faith is threatened, the very essence of their identity, they're more likely to be loyal to the state. This, of course, is a lesson that Roger Williams learned the hard way, fleeing from Massachusetts in the winter of 1636 and creating what I think is the best model we have of religious freedom, liberty of conscience in America, which is the model of Rhode Island. Let me say one more thing before ceding the floor. We talked about the Muslim majority world. One of the ambassador's first meetings was with Sheikh bin Baya. He took some fire from the right for that, which is ridiculous. Sheikh bin Baya is the real deal. He's been thinking about these issues and saying, why is citizenship and pluralism consistent with the best of Islam? How does the best of faith defeat the worst of religion when religion validates violence against innocence? And one of the things that we're trying to do or help initiate, catalyze, and the ambassador's been working on for some time is how do we get some of these dialogues into declarations into dialogue. There's the Jakarta Declaration at the eastern end of the Muslim majority world. There's the Marrakesh Declaration. The Uzbeks have been talking about a Bukhara Declaration that brings them together at this geographic center of the Muslim majority world. And what does Islam say about citizenship? And are there different takes on it theologically? That's not for me to comment on as a non-Muslim, but boy, I applaud that kind of effort. Last comment, because Samah referenced UAE. UAE is doing some good stuff. So is Qatar. They need some reconciliation of their own right now, which hopefully will begin to emerge maybe even later this month at the GCC. But we want in the Muslim majority world what it says in the Holy Quran: vie with each other in virtue, compete, outdo each other in good. And that serves everybody. Everybody wins when everybody has access to bring their faith into the public square. And back to the role of the government has to provide the table and make sure there's a seat for everybody. And then it's the role of civil society to come on in philanthropy and business to make sure that those rights are protected and promoted.
Thank you, Chris. You've obviously thought about this an awful lot, and there's an extraordinary amount of wisdom in what you say. Let's wrap this up, if I could, by asking each of you, beginning with Ambassador Brownback and then going through the sequences we have, to, I think, speak a little bit to the next administration. And Ambassador Brownback, I'm not going to tell you, obviously, what to say, but I wonder if you would include in your remarks the importance, from an ambassador at large's point of view, of the support of the Secretary of State. Now, we've had great secretaries of state since the RFA. Secretary Pompeo has been a staunch supporter from where I sit of everything you've done. How important is that? And maybe including that and the other themes that you would like to choose from this discussion, the ambassadors out there. You know, this executive order says to the ambassadors, you got to have a plan. My observation over the last 22 years is that we've had some splendid ambassadors out there doing great stuff, but it's been kind of ad hoc. Some of them really been good, but now this executive order says, I want everybody to have a plan. This needs to be all of government. This can't be a boutique office or a boutique issue. It needs to be everybody. So I think that's the very, very important theme. But first, Ambassador Brownback, what do you want to say to the next folks that are taking over here?
keep focused on the issue of religious freedom and not trying to use religious freedom for other issues that you may have. I think these issues like this, and I've been around this one for a long time. I helped carry the original human trafficking bill. I've worked on North Korea human rights. I've worked on Sudan Peace Act. These are bills that I did. You're best if you keep focused on what you're doing and not trying to get into somebody else's lane. So just stay focused on religious freedom. If you got other issues, bring them up, but have somebody else work them. You need the support of the Secretary of State, and I would urge that it be maintained aggressively as a bipartisan issue. At the second ministerial, the crowd gave standing ovations to both Secretary Pompeo's speech and Speaker Pelosi's speech. Standing ovations. And I was happy because this needs to stay bipartisan. And this is really pretty hard to do, guys, honestly, in this sort of partisan environment. But the key to it is to stay focused on what you're about, keep inclusive with everybody. And then if there's things that in particular rub one party or the other raw some way, don't do it. I did the original trafficking bill with Paul Wellstone, who was as far to the left. He was further to the left than I was to the right. And I had that distinction with him. He actually even blamed me. He was the most liberal member of the United States Senate, and he came in one day and the rankings had come out, and he was the second most liberal member of the U.S. Senate. And he came right over to me and he looked at me and said, "You did this to me. You made me the second most liberal member instead of the first." And I told him, I said, "Paul, hang around me and I'll get you reelected." We got to do it that way. And Paul and I, when we did the human trafficking bill, there was things I wanted in the bill that his folks on the left didn't want, and I dropped them. There was things that I wanted from the right, but his folks wouldn't. He dropped some things on his part. I dropped some things on my part. That's the essence of compromise and moving things forward. And this topic really needs that, and it needs to be maintained that way.
What characteristics would you suggest the new administration look for in an ambassador at large, in your successor?
I hope they would have somebody of substantial stature coming into the job. It helps so much to be able to travel around the world and meet with prime ministers and foreign ministers so that you can elevate the topic up. And often that comes with kind of years of experience and the stature that comes with it. I hope they would get somebody that would be focused and focused on the topic and aggressively bipartisan, and a person that has just personal passion about the topic. I hope as well, honestly, that they get a person of that faith is important to them personally, because you're dealing with so many people of faith. It just helps if your own faith is really important to you, because you understand where the other person's coming from, even if you don't share faith. The Muslim world leaders, I work very well with them, but I'm not a Muslim. I follow Jesus. But it's like, okay, I understand your language because you're a person of faith and so am I. And I think that's a very helpful thing in this role.
Great. Thank you for that. Samah, what do you want to say to the incoming administration, including, but not only, whatever you'd like to say, but including the USAID folks that'll be coming in and their continuation of this broadening that we have seen of our foreign assistance into this area?
Well, as a daughter of an immigrant and a person of the Muslim faith, I follow my faith, but I also cannot be a full Muslim if I don't believe in Jesus or Moses. And that's what I teach my kids. And that's what America is about. America's leadership is there's no other leadership in the world like this country's leadership. And I've been very privileged and honored to be serving this country in the capacity that I have been serving in. and been incredibly fortunate to be working on this issue for the past 3.5 years. America is on the forefront on this. Everyone in the world is looking at us, and they will judge us whether we were serious about it or not. And as Ambassador Brownback said, it shouldn't be tied to an anchor. It should be fighting for it, doing it, elevating it, promoting it, and institutionalizing it, because it's good policy. It's a good national security policy. It's a good for our leadership. I often tell my team these programs that we're trying to do to help communities and people around the world aren't just dollar figures. They tell real life stories, and I've met people that we've helped and made a difference in their lives. These are the real life stories of how America chooses to save lives and how America brings hope to persecuted peoples around the world. We must never forget that, and continue to do that. And I really hope that the next administration sees the value and the importance of this issue, not through the partisan politics, but through America's leadership and values and importance, and the hope that this policy brings to many, many people that have no voices, and we managed to make voices heard.
Great, and I gather from your comment that you really think it's important that we continue the ongoing integration of the U.S. Agency for International Development and this issue. I mean, we've always done some of this. It seems to have moved forward in the last several years, and it needs to continue to move forward. Again, thank you.
The last thing I would say is, throughout the 3.5 years, it was remarkable how throughout my travel to our missions around the world, that I've had foreign service nationals, the local employees that work for USAID overseas, come and talk to me and ask me and thank me for all this work and reassure me how important this work is. And they are my heroes in the field. So it's a remarkable change. And I really hope that the Biden administration continue to elevating that position, particularly at USAID, because it's important work.
Thank you. Okay, Chris, what do you say? What do you have to say to the Biden administration coming in, policy-wise, program-wise, anything you'd like to contribute here?
Sure. Let me begin with what I think is the most important that both Sam and Samah have touched on, which is you have to be comfortable with faith and hopefully know your own faith at its deepest best, as my dad loves to say, and enough about your neighbors to respect it. My experience, especially in engaging the Muslim majority world, is exactly what Sam and Samah have said, which is you actually accelerate practical action when you can talk about these things. And since this is the season of Advent of Isa al-Masih, Arabic in the Quran for Jesus the Messiah, and Samah has adopted 2 kids from Bethlehem, for which we are grateful for giving them an opportunity to live in this country. This is what it's all about. This is the great blessing of God. And are we going to agree on the nature of Jesus or any other figure? No, but we can agree to disagree agreeably. And that is how we move beyond tolerance, beyond diversity. And these are some of the things that we're encouraging at the Templeton Religion Trust. But here are some more specific things to think about. One is that the new administration is talking about a League of Democracies. I think that's a good idea. What does it look like? At the heart of any democracy is going to be liberty of conscience, the freedom to choose or not choose. How does that integrate into thinking about the alliances that are needed to take on global challenges? Second, there was a national policy put forward in August of 2013 by the previous administration about engaging strategic and religious leaders. That should be more fully developed. What's the relationship between religious freedom and religious engagement? Religious literacy, how does that look? 3, get the funding organized and work and get the money out to people who can do these things and the local actors. There's a model in northern Iraq that Samah has pioneered, but it's been done in other places around the world. Get the money out and let civil society do that. And you're not always going to be able to work with private philanthropy or corporate philanthropy, but you can do side-by-side mutual awareness. The ambassador and I did this in some ways in Uzbekistan, timing the trip of an American delegation to Uzbekistan when he was there to sign an MOU, a memorandum of understanding or framework between my previous organization, the Institute for Global Engagement, and the Uzbek government to plot a path forward of small steps that 2 years ago envisioned coming off CPC and off of the special watch list. Which also says is to say that we need training, religious literacy training. Religious literacy is a subject matter that is open to many definitions at this point. It exists along a spectrum, but if you engage somebody, you have to account for your interest and theirs and how it moves the ball forward in a practical, collaborative way. Well, I need to know something about the other. I need to know something about myself and what we're going to do together. There are different programs that are doing this in the academy. Sadly, the University of Vermont just canceled their program, which is crazy. University of Washington is doing stuff. Harvard just created a new master's program. There needs to be cooperation between the academy and between government to prepare officials to engage diplomatically and on defense and on development to advance American values and interest, with neither party being the proxy of the other. And then lastly, we need good research. Why is it that Vietnam and Uzbekistan came off the list? Let's have a top 10 best practices list as opposed to the worst violators. Let's promote best practices from around the world and why they're good at it, why their culture calls for those things. And lastly, let's come up with a new M&E, new metrics and evaluation that provide more nuance for that country and for the provinces within that country and the leadership within that country, and figure out what that looks like. Martha Brill-Olcott, who is a Central Asia expert, is doing a project at Michigan State right now about tracking pluralism and how it transitioned from during the Soviet Union to the former Soviet Union, the 15 states that result. Sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it does. But what are the local newspapers saying about these ideas? What are the local actors? How are they encouraged? How does American government come alongside local actors without tainting them? These are things that need to be thought through and researched and then studied and presented in a nonpartisan way, as is the tradition of religious freedom, according to the very best of who we are as a people.
Wow. Well, thank you, Chris. That's a splendid list. Let me just end by thanking all of our participants. This has been I would say, an intellectual and policy feast when it comes to this issue. I hope that there are those that are coming into the new administration who have been listening to this wide spectrum of wisdom, because this is important to our country. So I'll just sum up with 2 points. One, religion is important. It's important for every human being on the planet, including those who don't believe, because most people on the planet do. This country was founded on the belief that religion can play a role, a positive role. It needs to be limited in some ways, but it needs to be encouraged in other ways. And this is what our international religious freedom policy should be doing and is getting better and better at doing. Let me end by simply saying that the Religious Freedom Institute is going to be going to school on what has been said today, because we are going to do our 3rd edition of recommendations to new administration. We did it for the Obama administration, or the Trump administration. We're going to be doing it again. Thank you to each of you, Ambassador Brownback, Samah Norquist, Chris Seiple. Thanks to all of our viewers for joining us. We celebrate today America's international religious freedom policy. To all of you, goodbye and God bless you.
Thanks, guys.